section, but he'll probably be the third presenter.
Okay, good idea. Yeah, they'll be
How you
there.
doing? Yeah, didn't recognise you at first because everyone's in disguise these days. So.
I know.
Yeah.
And everyone's dressed up too. So
Right. That's even more weird, yeah.
How to turn this off?
He's just on there, right?
Oh, on there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we got
Is there a
this
controller?
You don't have to make it complicated.
Yeah.
Just push the button. Oh yeah, there you go. Cool.
Should we close the,
Oh yeah,
Line.
that's a good idea. Okay, cool. So that's that. And then just double check that. I think this should be shared. Better.
Yeah.
Just test it. You guys are actually going to do the last group. Hi, Connor. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Awesome. Would you mind trying to share your screen, even if you don't have your poster pulled up yet or anything, just because I want to make sure it's working?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. Okay.
technically also as something did depression.
Oh.
So we actually did find as extroversion increase.
Yeah.
So we get depression, but we get this.
Okay, but through self-blame.
Well, that was just one avenue, but we also on the graph. We see
On both? You guys are.
there was an average. Extroversion was high on average than introversion. Just wasn't significant. I know experience that introversion was actually worse off.
Right.
Like more negative.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. And on the graph, one where you have self-blame and graph. Correct on the graph.
Yeah, it is right.
Yeah.
We just didn't
Okay.
interpret it correctly.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. What you're saying.
All right, I just thought.
I'm glad you did. Oh, okay. Oh, okay.
I think it's a little bit more flowing.
Okay, that's fine.
I mean,
That's fine.
I can maybe.
How should we, do you want to email it to me real quick? I
Um,
don't know if that would be the best way.
yeah, we can do that. We can either do it that way, if you're getting on, or If we just share a screen with them when they're ready, that way they can kind of talk through it. Yeah.
That's fine, yeah, that's cool, we'll just have you all share screen, that's fine with me.
Funny. I don't know how much though. They can't recognize
Yeah.
I mean, that's real.
So was that Jacob who emailed him to you?
That's right, yeah.
Okay, cool,
Yeah.
so I just gotta wait, make sure when Allison comes in.
Yeah.
I like to make sure she's there.
Okay.
Okay, cool.
That might decrease.
Yeah, I just emailed them. You told them the Zoom's live, so anytime they want to jump on it.
Cool. I realized the student I was calling on was not actually, he's just an attendee.
Oh,
Put him on the spot.
Right.
I didn't check the names, I just didn't think
Yeah.
On average.
It's all good.
It's not lower, but it is significant. We have bigger population.
And actually, if you want, you could probably go ahead and pull up, if you have Jacob's slide.
Yeah, I got them both.
That might be good,
that way
because he's
or-
going first.
Before we look at it,
Right, okay.
oh, no, introversion quite often, you know, that's just, nothing changes.
I think I'd have to sign out as you, so I might just have to either email them to. Oh, he should be able to just get them up on his screen, I think.
Okay.
Just,
Yeah, as long as he's able to share.
yeah, I
Screen,
think so.
then it should
Well, we
work.
can make anyone a host on this temporarily, so we
Awesome,
can do it that way.
awesome. Sounds good. You guys didn't mind humoring me after the talk or whatever, I might try to take a picture of the lady. We technically have an Instagram account for the psychology department, but it's been very quiet.
Hmm.
And we're trying to get don't mind, get it going again. Yeah, you guys can see the rising stars. If you don't want to be on it, that's also fine. We'll take the picture regardless, and then if you don't want it publicly, just let me know.
Probably, we would expect that.
Yeah.
At the-
Yeah. I think we're trying. Yeah. I think this is fine. Sure, it's a little long.
both. You know,
Both, yeah.
you're selected based off like how you show that, and like I know Cameron he does service for $5 and things like that, and they're also supposed to promote throughout like what you do on the college campus and like what groups you sign up for, things like that.
Cool. So did you have to say what your troop was unified, or is it something they tell you like?
They tell you not to, but you like on your application you say which ones like mean the most to you.
Thank you so much for letting us know that we were muted. I'm glad you said that. Awesome. Can you hear us now? Yes, awesome. Thank you so much for letting us know. That would have been like a silent presentation, which would not have gone over well. Okay, so as I was saying, we are doing a poster session, which normally is pretty informal. You would walk around and look at the posters and chat with the presenters about their project or about themselves. We're going to try to keep that same atmosphere. We'll have lots of time for questions, and we really want all of you in the audience to ask a question, even if it's something really simple, like, what are you doing after this? What are your career goals? Where are you from? It's meant to be a conversation. So please don't be shy at all about typing questions in the chat, or unmuting yourself and just talking whenever we get to the question. So what we decided to do is we have three posters today. And whenever each poster presenter, they're going to share their screen, and you should see their poster then on your Zoom screen. And they'll give a relatively brief overview of their project. This is not a full-length talk, but they'll just sort of tell you what they did, and then we'll have time for questions. So our first presenter today is Allison Rodgers, and her project is called Pepper's Ghost: How a Martyred Puppy Led to the Passage of the 1966 Animal Welfare Act. So Allison, you can share your screen, share your poster with us, and go ahead and unmute yourself, and then tell us about what you did.
Okay, hi everyone. I am not a Zoom expert by any means, so if you can't hear me or can't see my screen or something, please let me know. I promise that it won't hurt my feelings. I'm gonna try to share my screen right now. Can you guys see this?
Yeah, we can see it, Alec. Yeah, we can hear you as well. Yeah, we can see it, Alec. Yeah, we can hear you as well.
Okay, perfect. You're not popping up on my screen. That's weird. Okay, so yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Allie, and my project is about Pepper the dog and her legacy in American politics. So I'm first going to talk about Ivan. We all have probably heard of Ivan. He is the psychologist who is famous for classical conditioning. And what's very interesting about Mr. Ivan is that he actually did not start his projects, his experiments, trying to learn about classical conditioning. He originally was studying how dogs digested their food. So what he did, he developed a system called shame eating. He would remove the dog's esophagus, cut an opening in their throat so that no matter how much the dog ate, the food would then fall out of their throat and the dog would re-eat it, meaning the food never actually reached the dog's stomach. By doing this, he could measure their chemical and quality processes. Now, obviously, this is pretty rough for the animals, and it was rough. I mean, this is mistreatment. But because there were no laws regulating this, he was allowed to do this. And this, which brings us to Piper. In the summer of 1965, Piper was stolen out of her family's backyard and sold to a hospital in New York. Piper's stealing wasn't just like someone stole her out of the backyard and took her to the hospital. It was about a 3-week journey where she was transferred from about 5 to 6 different people's hands. And she was sold at auctions. She was left out in the heat. She really went through a rough time before she made her way to the hospital. What happened at the hospital was doctors kind of used her to develop a procedure for heart surgery. So she passed away, and by the time her family found out what had happened to her, that she was stolen and sold, she was already dead. Her family was obviously devastated, and this started the advocate for animal welfare in Congress. President Johnson and his push for the Great Society made passing of these laws possible. Over time, there have been many laws passed, but the first one was the Animal Welfare Act in 1966, which is a direct effect of Piper and her story. Over the years, other laws have been passed, such as the Endangered Species Act and many, many others. Obviously, because it is politics, our two parties have disagreed and agreed on many different things, but we often see laws of some kind being passed to support animals. So President Trump passed a ban of painful, harmful hunting techniques in Alaska, and our current president, Biden, co-sponsored a bill which banned commercial seal hunting. So while we don't often hear about animal laws being passed in Congress, they often are, which I think is really important to note that like things are happening, which brings us to Tiger King. I'm sure that all of us have heard of Tiger King because the story is pretty out there. But what I wanted to talk about is privately ran exotic zoos, such as the one that Joe Exotic has more tigers in it than tigers alive in the wild. So there are more domesticated tigers living in the United States than there are wild tigers. In order to kind of stop this, about 3 days ago, a new bill was drafted. Now, this bill is titled the Big Cat Safety Act, and some of its key parts are making the transportation of big cats illegal. They think that if they can stop the moving of these big cats, then obviously more of them will stay in the wild. In regards to private zoos, it would make the breeding of any big cat illegal. So like what Joe Exotic was doing is now illegal. This is a direct line back to Pepper, of course, because she started all of this. And I think that it's important to note that this all comes back to Pepper. Her story paved the way for change in the United States in a way that like we didn't know that we actually needed until we needed it. So I'm going to come back and show my face, hopefully. Oh, there I am. Can you guys see my face?
Not on full screen yet. Not on full screen yet.
Okay. Does anyone?
I think you stop sharing screen, Mike.
Here, I'll stop sharing.
There we go.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions? I would love to answer like any questions about laws that you want to know more details about, or more about Pepper, or more about the legislation, the Great Society, anything you have.
Yeah, and people can feel free to unmute themselves and start talking, but you also could type in the chat. And I believe Doris is monitoring the chat. Is that right? So she'll let us know as questions come in from the chat. So I guess one question would be, just to start us off, would be how did you become interested in Pepper's story, and how did you first, how did they find out exactly what had happened to Pepper? How did they kind of crack the case?
Right. When I originally started this project, my goal was to focus more on Tiger King. However, Pepper's story is very interesting and it kind of caught my attention. So I turned my focus more towards the cause and effect, the legacy of Pepper's story. When I talked about Pepper's story in my actual research paper and right now, I summarized it very, very much. Pepper's actual journey to the hospital took about 3 weeks, and she passed through several different hands of like thieves, auctioneers. She even passed through the hands of a cop at one point, which interestingly enough, her family was going around to all of the city halls, all of the police stations in a so many mile radius, and actually like filing reports that their dog was missing. So in the article that I read about Pepper, I'm sorry, there are like police reports about her family talking about how she was missing and kind of like the date that she went missing. And interestingly enough, there was one man in kind of the countryside where Pepper lived that like stole all of the dogs and then sold them on. However, they couldn't like actually catch him stealing the dogs. So they really had no like tangible proof that it was him. So there is kind of like a police report, many different police reports. They kind of like narrow down Pepper's search, I guess. Her whole story is extremely interesting, and I could have done a whole 18-page paper about just her story. It's very complex.
Caitlin
Allison asked, when did you say the first legislation to prevent animal cruelty started to happen?
Right. The Animal Cruelty Act of 1966 was Congress started drafting it in 1965. And then as part of Johnson's Great Society, he signed the bill making it law in 1966, August 24th of 1966.
You mentioned different political approaches. Are there trends that you're seeing between maybe how left, right, center approach animal cruelty laws?
Right. I'm sure you guys remember a couple years ago, Donald Trump's son, I believe his name is Eric. Eric got in trouble for hunting big game in Africa. Like the media kind of saw it and kind of grabbed onto it. So I think that that's a pretty accurate representation of how they normally feel. The conservatives are more like open about it, I guess you could say. Like they're not quite as strict as we see the more liberal or the more Democrats being. Again, like any political spectrum, we do see some Republicans who are maybe lean a little bit more with the Democrats about these laws just because they are so personal, I guess. Like we all have dogs, and if like what happened to Pepper happened to our dogs, we would all be devastated. So I think that when considering legislation, the congressman kind of, I hope, put themselves in the shoes of Pepper's family.
Ali, do the states vary quite a bit from each other in terms of animal cruelty laws? I know a while, maybe 10 years ago, Missouri had a whole controversy about puppy mills, and apparently Missouri was one of the worst states for that. Can you talk a little bit about how that might vary by region of the country or by state?
Yeah, absolutely. With the passing of the Animal Cruelty Act of 1966, there is a little like line in there that says that the states can add more laws or create their own laws if they want to make this more strict. Missouri did have, I remember that, I was very young, but I remember that we did have some trouble with some puppy mills. And I think that it just goes to show the difference in all of the states. I know that Minnesota surprisingly has really, really strict animal cruelty laws. That was a trend that kept coming up when I was doing research, which I think is really interesting because you don't really think of Minnesota as being like somewhere with lots of animals. I don't know. So yes, the states do vary by what they choose to do. So like California has pretty strict laws. New York, where Pepper's story takes place, also has pretty strict laws because they were kind of the starting point for this whole trend. So they grabbed on pretty tight.
Keegan says, I know you mentioned that the transportation of big cats is illegal, but do you know if the private owning of big cats is illegal?
Right. That's a good question. So from what I've gathered, and again, this bill is just proposed, it's not actually a law yet. So not a super lot has been released about it. But from what I've gathered, as long as the private owners are not breeding the big cats, they can still have them for petting zoos. Part of the new bill talks about there having to be like fences between. If you watch Tiger King, you could just come up and like hold the baby tigers or pet the baby tigers. That's not allowed anymore. So yes, they can still own the animals and you can still go see the animals at the zoo, but you're not going to be able to like pet them or touch them or hold them just because.
Hannah asked, what made you choose this topic?
So this goes back to Tiger King. I actually have not seen Tiger King because I think that it's kind of ridiculous. And my me thinking it's ridiculous kind of led me down this road, honestly. I think that the story is incredibly interesting, but I disagree with almost every single thing that a Tiger King does. So my original focus when I started this was kind of deep diving into Joe Exotic and like maybe ripping him apart, I guess you could say, like being like, no, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong because of these laws. But then I heard about Pepper's story and I was like, you know, maybe I like this better than Tiger King. So I kind of went down that road instead.
Well, thank you very much, Allie. We
Oh.
enjoyed it.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Allie. Okay, so our next presentation is from Catherine Bloom, Ben Van Hookstraight, Morgan Deal, Haley Wilson, and Will Martin, and they're going to be talking about the role of personality in coping with the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm just going to share the screen up here. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's up to you all. If you want to stay or whatever. I mean,
Can they hear us?
Haley, why don't you say something?
Can you guys hear us from sitting down?
Yes, I gotcha. Let's do that.
During the current COVID-19 pandemic, students are at a higher risk for both depression and anxiety symptoms. Browning et al. Found that students have experienced largely negative impacts of COVID-19 on both their psychological health and their lifestyle behaviors. They found that the most changes were in a lack of motivation, anxiety, stress, and isolation, as well as having to social distance, changes in their education, and not being able to go out as much. Wishengard et al. Found that extroversion moderates the relationship between stringent or strict COVID-19 protective measures and depressive symptoms. We are extending past research by looking at mental health and personality during the current COVID-19 pandemic, as well as looking at the role global changes in society has on how an individual copes with new and additional everyday stressors that are brought on with the current COVID-19 pandemic. Extroverts usually draw energy from being around other people and being social. Unlike introverts, however, they aren't able to do that, especially if they are in quarantine. The purpose of the study is to both compare and evaluate the effects of different coping strategies that stem from the pandemic, as well as its impact on both anxiety and depression-related symptoms in both extroverted and introverted college students. Our first hypothesis was that we expected people who were more extroverted would experience the most depressive symptoms. Our second hypothesis was that we also expect people who are more extroverted are more likely to use maladaptive coping strategies.
So for the methods portion of our study, our participants were Westminster College students. They were primarily in introductory psychology courses. Their ages were ranging from 18 to 26, and they were predominantly female and white, as well as a majority of our participants were freshmen. So for the procedure of our study, due to COVID regulations, it was all conducted virtually. And so participants were given an informed consent form prior to actually participating in the study. Upon completion of that, they then took a series of surveys that measured the effects of personality on depression and anxiety-related symptomology, and then looking into the coping mechanisms that they used during the pandemic as well. Following the completion of those surveys, participants were then debriefed on the purpose of the study, and then the data was analyzed using factorial ANOVAs and correlation tests using Jamovi software. So for the materials of our study, we started initially with a demographic survey that was just gathering further background information on the individuals in the study. Following that, we then administered a brief COPE survey that measured coping mechanisms during the COVID-19 pandemic. And within this survey, there was 14 subscales, but we focused primarily on self-blame, humor, and substance use. Some of the survey questions included in this survey were statements like, I've been making fun of the situation, I've been criticizing myself, and I've been turning to work on other activities to take my mind off. The next survey that we administered was the Introversion Survey that was again looking at personality levels on a spectrum of just introversion and extroversion. Survey questions within this survey that we administered were things like, are you frequently lost in thought, and even when you should be taking part in conversation? Would you be very unhappy if you were prevented from making numerous social contacts? And are you inclined to keep in the background on social occasions? Following that survey was the COVID-19 stress survey that was used to determine how seriously participants were taking the pandemic to themselves. There were 3 subscales within this survey of relationships, fear of isolation, and contagion. Survey questions within this survey were statements like, how do you perceive the risk of contagion during the period of the COVID-19 pandemic? How do you perceive the relationships within your college and with your professors? And how do you perceive the condition of social isolation imposed during this period of the pandemic? Following that survey was the COVID-19 fear survey that was used to determine how seriously participants took the pandemic as well. Survey questions included statements like, it makes me uncomfortable to think about COVID-19. I'm afraid of losing my life because of COVID-19. And I cannot sleep because I'm worried about contracting COVID-19. Finally, we administered the DOS survey that was used to consider depression and anxiety symptomology. The 3 subscales within this survey was depression, anxiety, and stress. And then survey questions that were used within the survey were, I felt that I had nothing to look forward to. I felt I was close to a panic, and I was intolerant of anything that kept me from getting on with what I was doing.
An independent samples t-test showed no significant difference in depression scores between introverts and extroverts. So this kind of means that both introverts and extroverts were likely to develop the same levels of depressive-like symptoms.
A correlation test was done, and there was a relationship between introversion and the coping mechanisms self-blame, substance use, and humor. This showed a negative correlation between self-blame and introversion, a positive correlation between substance use and introversion, as well as a positive correlation between humor and introversion. So basically, this means that as self-blame increased, introversion decreased, and as substance use increased, so did introversion. A correlation was also done and there was a relationship between depression and the coping mechanisms self-blame and substance use. This showed a positive correlation between self-blame and depression, as well as a positive correlation between substance use and depression. So this basically means that as self-blame and substance use increased, so did depression.
A 2x2 factorial ANOVA showed a significant effect for fear, both high and low. However, there is no significant evidence for the main effect of introversion or for an interaction between introversion and fear. So what this basically means is that there is an effect on like fear for both high and low, and like depressive-like symptoms. So like if you're higher fear, there's some evidence that shows that it might lead to higher depression scores, and then lower fear would be the opposite, shown with the chart right there. And then the other results show that there's no other like relationship between the two or any form of effect from introversion.
So our data basically showed that fear of COVID-19 influences depression symptoms in college students. And as William said, those that have a stronger fear of COVID-19 showed higher rates of depression, and those that had a lower fear of COVID-19 showed lower rates of depression. So those who used humor as a coping mechanism showed lower depressive symptoms compared to those who used self-blame as a coping mechanism. And as Ben mentioned, introverted people were more likely to use substance use as a coping mechanism. The results of our study did not support our hypothesis that those who are more extroverted will experience more maladaptive coping strategies. Interestingly enough, more introverted people tended to show significant correlations with unhealthy coping mechanisms such as self-blame and substance use. So basically, our limitations of our study were that we had a small sample size and a majority of our participants were recruited through introductory psychology courses. And so the implications of our research is that more efforts need to be taken to focus on healthy coping mechanisms during the COVID-19 pandemic, and that we need to push schools to act more proactively towards the rising rate of depression. Interventions on appropriate coping mechanisms need to be taken advantage of for college-age students to be able to successfully navigate the pandemic.
can type in the chat, or you can also feel free to unmute yourself. So I think I may have a question for the audience, if I can do that, if that's allowed. I'm just curious what your all's impression is of the results. So during this COVID time, what have been some ways that you guys have tried to cope with some of the stressors that have happened? And do you think your personality plays a role in that, or your fear of COVID, has that affected how you cope with the pandemic? Maybe we'll just start with the first part, like, how have you guys coped with the pandemic? Humor. Can you give us an example?
Evan said, I'm introverted, so my life barely changed with lockdown.
I don't really think it was like highlighted enough. I mean, although our results weren't significant, we did actually find that extroversion did have an average higher, like on average was higher in depression than in introverts. So yes, our hypothesis wasn't supported because it wasn't significant, but I do think it is worth noting that extroverts on average were higher in depression. And they did indeed take up, but we did find that introverts took up like a more unhealthy coping mechanisms, which could be a result of like, you know, prior coping, or like there were some thoughts previously saying that introverts aren't like, it's like not black and white. And so it's not like you're an introvert or you're an extrovert. So it's like more of a scale. So you're, you could be like somewhat introverted or extremely introverted, but some part of you is still extroverted and still derives some social support rather than being, you know, truly from only your core. So which could explain why introverts, you know, are still experiencing more negative coping mechanisms.
To kind of like build off of that, like point two about it not being black and white. Initially, we were going to have 3 levels for introversion, mixed, and extroversion. But when we initially did it, a majority of people were mixed. So we decided that we were going to just split out between introversion and extroversion on which one they were more of, to kind of give more clear results. But if we had a larger sample size, we would have been able to have a more specific interaction, kind of account for that black and white side of it. I mean, not being black and white side of it.
And I think it's important to note on that too, the rate of fear and stress of COVID-19 also is going to be influencing those coping mechanisms, whether or not they're introverted or extroverted. That still plays a role in that factor, in that relationship too.
I'm not kind of get that what Kevin is saying, you know, he's introverted, and so, you know, the pandemic feels a little different.
Might be a little bit outside. Did you get any feed? No, this is mental for me.
Okay, that's better. Okay. All right. Did you guys get any feedback, even like circumstantially from students about some of the things they may have liked to have seen done differently, or suggestions, or even like come up in conversation or anything like that about ways in which some coping mechanisms could be employed?
Within our study, we didn't have that direct feedback.
Right.
Partly because of like the virtual aspect of that.
Yeah.
But
I think that's probably one of the things that if we were to go forward with this, we've definitely asked more open-ended questions, you know, fill in the blank rather than just, you know, A, B, C, or D, because it seemed like, you know, we didn't really give them a chance to open up and say their piece, because I'd imagine a lot of them would have some very useful things to say about that. Like,
You've obviously spent a lot of time thinking about this. Do you guys have any thoughts, or anyone online, in terms of like anything which could have coped or helped based on what you've seen, based on your results?
Yeah, there, for breaks,
Yes.
because, you know,
Yes.
we didn't really get any here at Westminster. We didn't get any breaks at all, so it's not exactly helping our mental health.
Yeah.
Especially on top of the fact that we're dealing with the pandemic right now, and we're just cramming in everything into this shortened semester.
That's one thing I would like, that would be interesting to further expand like this study and studies like this is like comparing different colleges and what they have to offer for these coping mechanisms. So like, I know we have a very active wellness center that offers therapy and all these stuff, and a lot of students know about it, but I know like other colleges are bigger, they might not know about it.
Sure.
And all these things that we have here that other colleges might not. So to see like how that could play an effect into like the fear of COVID and coping mechanisms.
I don't think you guys had a variable like this, but it would also be interesting to see if like incoming freshmen, like this is their first year in college, if they experience high levels of depression or those they've had the time to adjust and meet friends.
We did ask them a year in school. Did not run the test for it because I don't think we had a large enough sample size.
Right.
Because also largely due to the fact that a good portion of our participants were in those intro-level psychology classes, so they were primarily freshmen and sophomores. So we wouldn't have a very good comparison like seniors and stuff like that. But yeah, and I also think it would be very good to, if we were to continue doing this, like, you know, after the pandemic, do the same kind of tests, do the same everything, and see where people lie on that spectrum and compare it to how we, you know, were during the pandemic, and see if there was an overall higher, you know, stress, depression, anxiety, like levels.
How are you defining introversion and extroversion in the study, and how did you determine who was introverted and extroverted? Again, I'm not quite sure if I'm seeing it correctly.
So we used these scales that were developed prior. We didn't make our own scales. We didn't make our own questions. So basically, we gave them surveys, and then based on how they answered on those questions, that we were given a calculation to then put them on a spectrum of where they lied. So originally, we were going to have, as William said, we were going to have introversion as a, you know, like a highly introverted or extroverted or like more moderate, but pretty much everyone was moderate, so it was impossible to do that kind of thing. But basically, we just had scales where we asked specific questions. Each question had its own value that we plugged into a calculation, which gave us like a value to determine how introverted or extroverted they were.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you all very much. And then we have our last presentation then is Jacob Marshall. So I'll stop sharing my screen. Jacob, if you want to go ahead and share your screen, and then I'll introduce you. Okay. So Jacob Marshall, his poster is about financial and cultural impact of distance running within Kenya and Ethiopia.
Yes, I am currently I'm currently waiting for the rest of my track and field team to leave, so I'll be on the move for a big portion of this.
Sure. Okay.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and go to PowerPoint. Yes, and I did my research on track and field running, distance running within Kenyan and Ethiopia, and found correlations between them and other groups in Japan, and how both them and Japan have given a great deal of emphasis on what they consider important in distance running for different reasons, of course. With Kenya and Ethiopia, their culture is more about trying to compete in distance running, and trying to win major competitions, while in Japan, one of the major groups of distance running people are the monks of Mount High, or Mount Hiei.
Jacob, sorry to interrupt a second. Are you able to
Yep.
share your screen? We're not able to see your poster yet.
I thought I did share.
It's not showing up. Okay, looks like it's coming through now. Hold on.
Are you seeing it now?
If you click on your, there you go. Yeah, if you can just make that full screen, I think we should be good to go.
What do you mean? Yeah, on mine, it is full screen.
There's probably a slight delay, but okay, you're good to go. We can see.
So yes, mine is about different cultures in distance running and their economic and cultural impacts upon distance running. And so I focused on Kenya and Ethiopia, Japan, and a Greek runner who ran the Boston Marathon to try to raise funds for post-World War II Greece. And so the first group, Kenya and Ethiopia, are people who tend to try to compete at the world-class level and try to win the biggest competitions in the world, such as the Olympics in like the 10K, the 5K, the Boston Marathon, all of these events from 3 miles up to the marathon distance of 26.2 miles. And then you have people who come from Kenya and Ethiopia to countries like the United States, like Mayo here, who came to the United States and became a part of the United States Army through the World-Class Athlete Program, where they take world-class athletes and they train them and they give them time to prepare for the World Championships and Olympics in their particular sport. And Mayo is the United States Army's official marathon runner. So he goes to the Olympic trials for the marathon and tries to get into the Olympics for the United States Army. And then there's the Greek runner from, there's the runner from Greece named Stalianos Kyriakidis, who ran the 1946 Boston Marathon to raise funds for post-World War II Greece because it had been particularly ravaged by being invaded by the Nazis and Italy. And he was actually given death threats for entering the Boston Marathon, but still completed it anyway, and ended up winning with people being surprised that he even survived because there were legitimate death threats against him. And there are the monks of Mount Hiei, who they attempt to run approximately the distance of a marathon every single day for 1,000 days in a row. And they do this to try to exhaust themselves to the point that they can reach enlightenment. And this is a task that only 46 men have achieved in the past 130 years, that it has been a tradition for the monks of Mount Hiei to attempt. And a man named Adharanan Find tried to meet some of the people who actually successfully did 1,000 days of this grueling training, and he was only able to meet the priest who actually was able to complete it. But as the priest stated, the vast consciousness that lies below the surface of our lives, beyond the limits of our usual everyday experience, a sense of oneness with the universe, was how he described completing this task. So to them, it was more about trying to reach a spiritual enlightenment rather than competing with other people, trying to make money. And of course, in my conclusion of my research, running has historical meaning because people are willing to put strenuous effort into it. There are people who have exhausted themselves to collapsing because of running. There are people who put years of training into it so that they can be physically prepared for foot races. And there are people who use running as a way to exhaust themselves so they can reach enlightenment. And running is ultimately a tool for achieving many goals, from communicating messages to the modern race to going from one place to another by foot quickly. And it is an important skill that has been effectively used to communicate, attain glory, and peacefully compete against people across the world.
So questions, again, you can type in the chat, or also just you can unmute yourself and speak. And yes, we have some virtual clapping going on.
How did you reach this topic?
Well, I myself am a distance runner.
Which of the runners did you most relate to or connect with personally?
I'd say Stylianos Kyriakides, just because he from being in a post-World War II Greece was actually had been starving for years, and that was another reason why they didn't think that he could actually win the Boston Marathon, is because he had dealt with famine for years. And he was just trying to win, not for himself, but to raise funds for people who he cared about.
Did he win? I
Yes,
forgot.
he did. He won the 1946 Boston Marathon.
In your research, did you run across any health impacts of this? I'm thinking especially of the really extreme cases of the Japanese monks who run a marathon every day for many, many days.
The monks definitely had negative health impacts, but that was kind of part of the point. Is they're literally trying to exhaust themselves to the point that they don't have their mental faculties, because they're trying to get to their inner spirit, their inner soul, to reach enlightenment. But with marathon training in general, I've not found any major negative health impacts. To have negative health impacts, you basically would have to go through the process that the monks of Mount Hiei were going through. The human body is capable of running a lot of miles every day for years upon years without many negative health impacts.
How far do you personally run every day?
It depends on the days. I have some days that I do 90-minute runs, and then some days where I only have to do 30-minute runs. And it's, I always do time intervals because sometimes I'll be running out on the trails, so I'll run a lesser distance just because I can't run as fast as on the treadmill or on the track in hack gym.
Could you say a little more about the, I believe the Ethiopian runner who represents the army? How did they choose him again? I wanted to know a little more about that.
Well, they chose him because he just so happened to be the fastest marathon runner in the army. He came to America from Ethiopia, and he isn't really the fastest from Ethiopia, but he decided to come to America because he was at the time one of the fastest in the 5K and 10K, and eventually went up to the marathon. And nobody in the army has ever been able to really compete with him in the marathon distance. The next fastest man in the marathon in the entire United States Army is about 2.5 to 3 minutes slower than him.
Thank you. Nice job, Jacob.
What makes you so passionate about running? What's your favorite thing about it?
Personally, I like doing it just because it's something that whenever I started, I ended up being very good at it. And it just came naturally.
Any questions for Jacob? Okay, well, thank you very much, Jacob. Enjoy the rest of the undergraduate college course.
Good job, everyone.
People in the Zoom room, so like when the clapping, it's not that awkward.
Yeah, right.
I can take a picture if you need to. You need me to take a picture?
Oh, I was just gonna take it down. Thank you, though. Thank you, though.
Probably
I
just
guess you
joined
can
in
do it,
on
and
that.
I can get in, I guess. Yeah. You wanna do that? Okay, thanks.
No, surely not.
Thank you. I thought you were about that.
We're doing it around the.
I think so. Do I put the light on? I don't know if that would work. I don't know either. We'll try it.
Thanks, Abby.
Thanks,
That was fun.
Mars. Enjoy the rest of your.
You too. Thanks.
You
Well done,
have
guys.
you have more coming up, I know.
Morgan, I'm gonna get in touch with you. Oh, should we? Okay. Oh. Morgan, I'm gonna get in touch about next fall. Hopefully we can meet together this semester.
Okay, yeah.
I look forward to working
Sounds
with you.
good.
All right. See ya.
Might or might not actually work.
Oh, that's awesome.
I can kind of do a little
Yeah.
squat.
Here, Haley, you can.
It feels so odd.
A little 10 participants on you. Looks good.
The great thing about last week, people smiling.
Oh, I was smiling still.
You gotta still smile in the eyes.
I avoid smiling as much in photos.
I squinted my eyes and hope for the best.
That's what I do.
That works. It's like
Nice
overemphasized.
work.
That's true. That's probably good thing. Well, thanks all. Great work. Great work. I'll email this to you guys, and if anybody doesn't want it on social media, let me know. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your undergrad. Bye. Bye. Have a good day.